Kyiv and Western leaders have been accusing Vladimir Putin of dragging his feet in US-led peace efforts in an attempt to capture more Ukrainian land. Amid mounting frustration with the Kremlin, Donald Trump said this week that he was giving Moscow a shorter deadline of next Friday to make efforts to end the war or face punitive US sanctions and tariffs. Well, following the latest Russian attacks overnight, President Zelensky is now calling for more pressure to be placed on the Kremlin to end the war.
And I believe Russia can be pushed to stop this war. It started it, and it can be made to end it. But if the world doesn't aim to change the regime in Russia, that means even after the war ends, Moscow will still try to destabilize neighboring countries.
With more, we are joined now by Vasily Astrov, senior economist at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Vasily, thanks so much for being with us on the programme. As we say, Donald Trump shortening that deadline that he's placed on Russia. How seriously, though, will Moscow be taking these threats that are coming quite regularly now from the White House?
Well, so far, the Russian government hasn't been taking this threat very seriously. The thing is that, on the one hand, the direct trade between Russia and the US is very small. So only 1% of Russian exports go to the US. So the main thing is really about the secondary sanctions. So President Trump famously threatened, in particular, China and India with very high tariffs for the fact that they buy Russian energy, Russian oil. And here I think one should distinguish. So China has very strong cards, and it has already said that it will not comply by these by the sanctions, or it will not abstain from buying Russian oil, whereas in the case of India, we already see the first signs that that India may be really may change its course and yield to pressure under President Trump. So you really see a difference in approach between these two countries.
And perhaps it's difficult to know exactly, but after more than 3 years of war, what kind of state is the Russian economy currently is? You point out that economic growth has slowed, but that the Russian central bank, it has been making efforts to, ease the situation somewhat.
What we see in Russia now is that there has been a pronounced growth slowdown. So basically, growth almost came to a standstill after 2 years of economic boom, of overheating, which was very much triggered by the extensive military spending. Now that is over. So the party is over. The economy is facing stagnation. In my view, there are two main reasons for this. So on the one hand, this is the very tight monetary policy which has been pursued by the Russian central bank. So far, yes, you mentioned that the policy rate has been lowered a little bit, but starting from a very high level. And so the interest rates are still very high, especially in real terms, so after adjusted for inflation. And this, of course, this is a problem for all those who want to take credits. They cannot buy consumer durables, they cannot buy real estate. Many companies cannot invest because they cannot afford to take credits at these very high interest rates. So this is the main problem. So it's domestic policy mistakes, in my view, and they will be corrected. It is clear that the central bank will continue lowering the interest rates over the next few months. That is clear. And the second factor is also something that, it is not directly related to sanctions. It is related to the fact that the oil prices have fallen. So in the first half of this year, the global oil prices were about 20% lower than the year before. And of course, this is a problem for Russia because for Russia, still the main export commodity is oil. So oil prices affect very much the state of the economy, and in particular the situation of the federal budget. So because a large part of the budget revenues is derived from oil sales.
Yeah, and we saw just yesterday Donald Trump was, threatening India with further punitive measures and sanctions, etc., over the fact that it's continuing to buy Russian oil. So what way would that have been? What would the reaction have been to that in Moscow, do you think? Those kind of threats that he's not directly putting them to Russia, but, they're still going to be affected if Donald Trump is threatening these other countries with particular measures like that.
Well, there might be problems, of course. The official Russian reaction has been that we've heard what President Trump has said. The spokesman of Mr. Putin, Mr. Peskov, has said that Russia is now largely immune to sanctions. Yes and no. Yes, Russia has been able to adapt to many sanctions. That is true. On the other hand, President Trump is now attempting something completely new. So imposing secondary sanctions, not on individual companies, as for instance President Biden has been doing, or private individuals, but he is really threatening putting sanctions on the whole country. Yeah. So in that case, India, for instance, and that is of course a big difference. Yeah, and it may, as I already indicated, it may well be that India will yield to this pressure, because for India, India doesn't have very strong cards, unlike China. So what does it mean? So if India refuses to buy Russian oil, this will be a short-term shock for sure. This will be a shock for Russia, and it will be also a shock for the global oil market. So the oil price will rise, I think, until new export destinations are found. So Russia will try to redirect its oil sales towards other countries. So it will be a bit of a game of cat and the mouse. Probably Mr. Trump, if he wants to really continue this course, he will have also to target other countries who will become important buyers of Russian oil.
And our international affairs commentator, Doug Herbert, he said a short while ago that, people in Russia, they're not taking to the streets in protest currently. So how is all of this being, greeted by people in Russia? We're hearing reports of things like a potato shortage amid rising prices. So how are ordinary people there in Russia reacting and responding to all of this?
The thing is that these problems in the economy, which I have outlined, they are relatively new. So we are really talking about the last few months. Up until recently, so up until the beginning of this year, it was a time of an economic boom. And it is true that quite a few Russians started living better, so their living standards improved despite all the problems with inflation and so on. So what we are facing now is, of course, it will not boost the popularity of the government on the one hand, but on the other hand, let's not forget that the economy is only one factor, and there are also other factors that are not, which have nothing to do with the economy. So, for instance, the situation on the battlefield is very important. Yeah, we have seen over the past few years that the main threat to the Russian regime has come from the guy called Yevgeny Prigozhin. He was the guy who had a private army, a Wagner group, and he started basically, a rebellion, a march on Moscow and so on. And he capitalized on the popular dissatisfaction with the failures of the Russian army on the front, on the battlefield. So these factors also play a role, and let's see how it will, how the situation will develop over the next months and years.
We'll see. Vasily, thanks so much for joining us. That is Vasily Astrov, Senior Economist at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Thanks so much.